Ex-prisoners of war constitute a unique segment of America's veteran population. For not only did all of them serve frontline duty in combat, they also suffered the double stresses of capture and imprisonment by an enemy state. This tape is being recorded on the 16th of October in the year 2000, which incidentally is my 82nd birthday. My crew and I were part of the 8th Air Force. We flew over as a replacement crew in May 1943. As a matter of fact, we left America on Memorial Day from Dowfield, Maine, and we were assigned to the 306th Bomb Group, 423rd Squadron of the 8th Air Force based in Thurlow, England. In those days, the losses were rather high in the 8th Air Force. You only had to go on 25 missions, but not many crews were going that far. And as it happened, we went down on our 13th mission, which occurred on the 6th of September 1943. Our 13th mission. One of the toughest things about a combat mission was getting up in the morning. They'd always tell you the night before that you were going on a mission and to try and get some sleep. Well, it was very hard to sleep, and I would usually sit up reading a book until midnight, and at 2 o'clock in the morning the corporal would come around and shake my shoulder and say, "Wake up, Lieutenant, wake up." And I really felt kind of depressed. You didn't think you were going to get killed, but there was always that possibility. And one of the problems for me was my younger brother. I was quite prepared to die. I didn't think it would happen, but I'd lived to be 23 years old. A lot of people didn't get that far. But just so it happened quickly. And I figured that my stepmother and my father, my brother and siblings could all handle it pretty well if I died because it was wartime. But my younger brother was, at that period, checking out as a navigator, and it seemed to me that he might be coming over to the 8th Air Force too, and the fact of him getting killed as well as me depressed me. At any rate, we went to the breakfast. It was always important to eat a big breakfast before you went on these missions because you'd be going for about 8 hours without food and flying at the high altitudes we did without air pressure, unpressurized cabins, and in the bitter cold. For 8 hours, it was quite a strain. You got hungry. And it was a lot of physical work flying a B-17. There was no such thing as power steering. After 8 hours of pushing that plane around in formation, you felt tired. But at the briefing room that morning, it told us that we were going to be bombing the Bosch Magneto Works in Stuttgart, Germany. Stuttgart, Germany was a deep penetration for us, and we were having a problem then with deep penetrations because we didn't have the extra fuel tanks that B-17s later on had. We would sometimes come back so low on fuel from deep in Germany that we would have to cut the outboard engines and make a power glide to reach the coast of England. The fighters, by the way, didn't have extra fuel either. They could fly only a little ways into France and have to turn back. Later on they got the P-51s, and that changed everything. But when we were there, we didn't have those P-51s, nor the long-range fuel tanks of the B-17s. Before we took off, a very sad thing happened. Two of our crew members, the top turret gunner, Leo Lewer, and the ball turret gunner, Ken Rood, were hurt. They were thrown from a jeep on the way out to the plane and were badly injured. Poor Lewer was really badly injured. He had a compound fracture in his leg. The bone was sticking out. And I remember holding him until the ambulance came, and we had to get replacements the last minute. We still had blood on our flying clothes when we took off, so this was sort of almost like a bad omen before we even got going. Our group, the 306 Bomb Group, was not the lead group that day. We were flying to the right in a high box formation, and I mention that because the German attacks followed sort of a standard pattern. The German fighters would always come up to the side of us, out of range, and they would hit the right side going in because that would give them the sun at their backs. The fighters were faster than we were. They would fly, as I say, out of range, and they would get ahead of us and then attack head-on. The German pilots quickly discovered that the weakest part of the B-17 was the front of it. And so they come in head-on. And later on, the B-17s got chin turrets, a double pair of guns in the front, which helped. But at that time, we, of course, didn't have them. The morning we went in, of course, the Germans had a habit of attacking us in and out. They seemed to get a pretty good idea of where we were going, and they would come up in groups from various airfields going in and going out and carry on their attacks. Now, we were hit by Me-109s, and in one of the attacks, well into German airspace, they got my number 2 engine. That's the inboard engine on the left side. They hit a bullet or shell fragment, punctured an oil line. The oil pressure sank to 0, so I had to stop the engine and feather the propeller to keep it from whirling out of control. Now, the thought then was, in looking at it now, it might have been better if I'd gone back to England. But there was safety in those formations, and I thought I could get to the target. We were there, after all, to do the job of carrying out these bombing missions. And I'd had an experience, my crew and I, we had an experience just a few missions before when we had to come back from the Ruhr with two engines missing, and we nearly got our heads shot off. So I decided to stay with that formation, carry on, and as soon as we dropped our bombs over Stuttgart, I would dive to the deck and fly at treetop level across Germany, France, and the Channel and back to England. But that was not to be. The mission was being led by a brigadier general who sat in the lead plane, and when he approached the target, he didn't see the target clearly. There was some cloud cover way down below, and so he made a second pass. Now, this could be construed to be a brave and determined act. However, it threw the following formation's bomb groups into wild confusion because no one could find alternate targets. And so what happened was that this great mass of airplanes began orbiting around southern Germany. And, fully an hour was used up in this big eddy of airplanes. And this was, of course, burning up fuel. I was running my 3 remaining engines at full manifold pressure, full RPMs to stay up with that bomb load. And my co-pilot, Keith Rich, who was watching the fuel gauges, informed me, look, we're not going to get home anymore. We're not going to get to England. We're not going to reach the coast of France, much less England. Now, the 8th Air Force lost 45 bombers that day, and about 18 of them went down simply through a lack of gasoline. They ran out of fuel. So in that position, knowing we couldn't get home, there were 2 options. One was to fly until we ran out of gas, and hopefully we'd be over France, and we had a chance of bailing out and escaping. The other was to go to Switzerland. We are, after all, deep in southern Germany. You could see the Alps, the distance about 40 miles away. But the idea of going to Switzerland seemed like quitting, or we're not here to do that. We'll go as far as we can. And so after we dropped our bombs and after I made that decision, the tail gunner, Henry Hucker, called up in great excitement to tell me that number 4 engine was on fire. That's the outboard engine on the right side. I looked out past Rich to check it out, and from Hucker's point of view, it must have looked like it was on fire, but it really wasn't on fire. It was overheated. There was pre-ignition in the cylinders, and black smoke was pouring out of the cowl flaps. So there was nothing to do but to throttle back on it. Now, this left me with 2 engines. I'm now a cripple over Germany. I'm alone. The rest of the bombers are flying away from me. And that made me decide that I better try to get to Switzerland while there still was a chance to do so. So we turned south, and just after we made that turn, we were attacked by 4 FW-190s, Focke-Wulf, the other standard German fighter. And they were coming straight at us. Unfortunately, the rate of closure was fast. They didn't do much damage. They nicked the propeller in the number 3 engine, but they didn't do serious damage. And best of all, they didn't come back to play with us. I've often wondered about the pilots of those 4 planes. They had, after all, an easy kill, and German pilots were as eager as our own fighter pilots to build up their kills. But maybe they were student pilots. Maybe they were headed for the formation that was flying away from us. But at any rate, they didn't come back after us a second time. And by now we're losing altitude. We're down to about 10,000 feet. And I could see the Lake of Constance. Now, that I knew was in the northern side of Switzerland. But as we approached the lake, we came across Friedrichshafen, Germany, where they pumped up a lot of flak at us. Now, flak, it didn't bother me as much as the German fighters, but it's still upsetting. And the explosions going around me started me thinking, maybe some pocket south of that lake is part of Germany. So I called the navigator over the intercom and said, look, I think we should make a right turn south of that lake. I think the most level part of Switzerland is to our right. Well, I happen to be right, but I'm only guessing. The co-pilot, or rather the navigator, disagreed. He said, no, Andy, if we do that, we'll be over occupied France or Germany, and we're still in trouble. Now, another thing, we had no maps. We had no idea we were ever going to go to Switzerland that day, and we had no maps of Switzerland whatsoever. But each crew member had an escape kit, which Bowers opened. And in the escape kit, there was some foreign money, some hard chocolate, a compass, a knife, and a handkerchief. And on that handkerchief was printed a map of Europe. Now, Switzerland was part of that, but Switzerland, being small, was quite small on that map. But that's all we had to go by. So we're heading south, and of course the Alps are right ahead of us, and we're soon right down, losing altitude and flying among the peaks. The bombardier put our Norden bomb sight out of commission, and the 2 waist gunners threw their guns into the wildest part of the Alps to try and lighten up the airplane. And one of the crew, I remember the radio operator called up over the intercom and said, look, should we prepare to bail out? Oh, no, you don't want to do that. I said, no one's going to bail out of this airplane. You could kill yourself trying to parachute into those mountains. Don't worry, we still have 2 good engines, and I'm going to land this airplane soon. So the Alps are not a very wide band of mountains, and we've soon crossed the Alpine Divide. We're letting down. I can see a sort of a Piedmont ahead in airfields, but German airfields, there were swastikas everywhere on those planes. So now I called the navigator up to the cockpit, and I wanted to look at that handkerchief map too. And fortunately, it had on it, small as Switzerland was, a lake called Lago Maggiore. It's the largest of the finger lakes that stretch from Italy into Switzerland. And that Lago Maggiore was clearly on that map, and the northern tip certainly lay in Switzerland. And that seemed to be that lake over to our right. So I immediately flew over there and tried to look for some place to land. There was a little stream that ran into the lake from the north, and I was looking at that when suddenly a Swiss fighter plane came up alongside us, easily recognized by the white cross on the red tail. And he managed to, through hand signals, point to a field that was right at the end, the very tip, northern tip of Lago Maggiore. This was a little place I later learned was called Magadino. Well, I'd never landed a B-17 on grass before, and the field wasn't very large, but our plane was very light. We'd dropped our bombs. We had very little ammunition left. We had almost no gasoline. I learned from the Swiss later that we had less than 5 minutes of gasoline when we landed. So the plane was light, and I figured by coming in low across the lake, low across the water, I could use every bit of that grass field and get it in all right. But as I was making on my base leg across the lake, headed to the final approach, I was looking at the field, and I noticed that the Swiss had ringed the field with soldiers. There were soldiers everywhere I looked. So my last words to the crew as I'm coming in for a landing is, go out of this airplane with your hands in the air. I see soldiers everywhere. They all have guns. I don't want anyone hurt. Go out of this plane with your hands in the air. I might add, there was one other thing about that. Before that landing, we had been told that if we ever landed in Switzerland or Sweden, to destroy the airplane. And we had aboard the plane, for that purpose, 4 incendiary bombs. They were about the size of a soft drink can with a cap on one end, and when you hit the cap, there would be a time delay of about 7 or 8 seconds, and it would start burning. It was thermite. It would burn very fiercely, and there was also a spike on the other end. You could drive them into metal. Now, I told the navigator to set one of these thermite bombs off in the nose of the airplane. The radio operator was going to set one off just behind the bomb bay. The co-pilot was going to set one off in the cockpit, and I'd pull the ripcord on my parachute to spread the silk so the flames would spread quickly there. And I was going to take the 4th one myself. I was going to crawl out in the wing when I stopped the airplane. I could get out of the cockpit window and get out on the fuselage, on the wing of the airplane, and with this spike on one end of this thermite bomb, I could drive it into the metal of the wing just above the empty gas tank behind number 2 engine. And once the thermite hit that number 2 engine, the airplane would surely explode. Well, anyway, we come in for our landing. The Swiss are all there. They have 2 trucks of soldiers racing alongside of us, and I needed every bit of that field to get that plane down. I rolled right up to the end, and there are these Swiss soldiers standing their ground. And everyone did as he was told, and I started crawling out of the wing with my thermite bomb. And these Swiss soldiers are dressed very much like German soldiers, and they speak a dialect of German, Schweizer Deutsch. And I couldn't understand what this soldier right below me was saying, but he was pointing a gun at me, and I began thinking very fast, I'm going to look pretty silly, if not hostile, trying to set a bomb off on this wing while he's pointing a gun at me from 15 feet away. So I decided I'll set mine off in the cockpit too. So I got back in the cockpit, and since the co-pilot had already left, I hit the bomb on the control column so hard I tore the skin on my hand a little bit, but I dropped the bomb and exited the plane through the bottom escape hatch. Well, as it turned out, none of these bombs worked. And then as it turned out, we learned that the Army didn't want them destroyed after all. They ceased that practice. But anyway, we're now down in Magadino, and we now met Captain von Meis. He is was the Swiss fighter pilot who led me to this landing field. A wonderful man. I've been in touch with von Meis ever since. A very, very urbane, fine person. And, of course, he took the crew and me to the officers' club where they gave us sandwiches and coffee. And they began asking questions, but I started a rule then, and I followed it all along, that they were all very friendly, these Swiss officers, but I told them I can tell you nothing about what we're doing until I meet a U.S. military attaché here in Switzerland. In fact, the Swiss thought it rather amusing that my crew and I all insisted that we're tourists. From Magadino, we were taken under guard to the town of Bellinzona, which is the capital of Ticino, the Italian canton of Switzerland. The Ticino, by the way, is one of the loveliest parts of Switzerland. It's got mountains, vineyards, flowers. It was really very beautiful. And we were put up for the night in a school on the 3rd floor. And the Italian Swiss were very demonstrative. They gathered in crowds in the street below. We were on this little balcony, and they were cheering and yelling, and it was almost like you were Lindbergh coming into this country. In fact, one of our waist gunners, Walter Kozlowski, who was the youngest man in my crew, was only 18, he got so carried away with this that he stayed up long after the rest of us, still waving to the pretty girls down in the streets below. But the next morning we were taken by train to Zurich, to an airfield, a military airfield called Dubendorf. And there, after spending the night, I was taken out to a B-17, which was on the airfield there, and led into it by 3 Swiss flying officers who asked me, when I got inside, to show them how to start the airplane. Well, I said, I'm afraid I can't do that. Whereupon they said, well, let us show you how we would start it. And of course, they started it with no help from me whatsoever. So this was rather embarrassing, but now I got a little worried. I figured they're going to try flying these airplanes, so I did talk with them about stalling speeds, other flight characteristics of the plane, so no one would get hurt. And incidentally, many years later, I learned that the U.S. Military attaché had purposely had me go to Dubendorf to help the Swiss, but no one had told me that, and wasn't about to tell them anything at the time. But the only untoward incident that occurred for me and my crew as we came into Switzerland happened in Bern. We were taken from Dubendorf to Bern, the capital, and there I was brought into the office of the man who I was told was the chief of intelligence of the Swiss army. He was a very tall man, a colonel, and very dour. He didn't say anything when I went into his office. He motioned me to a chair in front of his desk. And when we sat down, he said, "Lieutenant Andrews, tell me about your mission to Stuttgart." So I began with my usual demurral. I said, "I'm very sorry, Colonel, but until I meet a military attaché here, I can tell you nothing about our mission." And at this point, he flew into a rage. He picked up a bunch of newspapers from his desk, and it said, let me get go back a little. The same day that I landed in Magadino on the Stuttgart mission, 4 other American bombers went into Switzerland. One ditched in the Lake of Constance, where a man was killed. One went into a farmer's field, and 2 others landed there at Dubendorf, at Zurich, and that was one of the planes that I was taken into. So the colonel had all these newspapers, and he was saying, "Look, you won't talk to the head of the Swiss intelligence, but you people are perfectly willing to talk to our journalists, our reporters." Well, I'm looking at these newspapers he was putting in my face, and clearly those airmen and those 2 planes had talked freely with reporters. But I said, "Colonel, I'm very sorry. I can't explain the action of those Americans. I can only tell you that I am not yet at liberty to speak to you or anyone here about military matters of the United States." This adherence to orders actually worked in my favor, because the day after I landed in Switzerland, when we went from Bellinzona to Zurich, my crew and I were in this compartment when a civilian walked in, a middle-aged civilian, who asked to speak to the pilot of the plane that landed yesterday at Magadino. He introduced himself as Alan Dulles and asked if I would come back and talk with him in his compartment. Well, I said, "Mr. Dulles, I've heard of your brother. John Foster Dulles was already well known as an advisor to America on foreign affairs. But until I meet a military attaché here in Switzerland, I'm perfectly willing to talk to you about my boyhood in Wisconsin, about my days in college, but about what I did yesterday, nothing." Dulles liked that, I think, because maybe he felt people should be more discreet. So we had a very pleasant conversation back in his compartment, in which he told me about his boyhood days in Auburn, New York, and his college days in Princeton. But that meeting with Dulles turned out to be a very critical thing, because it resulted just 6 months later in being exchanged from Switzerland, being exchanged for a German officer to go back to the United States at the behest of Alan Dulles. My crew and I were taken first in Switzerland to an internment camp at Machelen-sur-Bienne in the Jura Mountains. This was suddenly, it gave you a feeling of being a prisoner. Pilots were not allowed to leave the internment camps while I was there, because the Swiss demanded it for reasons of discipline. Some soldier early on had assaulted a Swiss chambermaid, and so the pilots had to stay with the crew. But anyway, in Machelen, we had our first taste of, in a sense, being a prisoner of war in a neutral country. We were not as harshly treated, certainly, as they were in regular German or Japanese prison camps, but we were confined. We couldn't go anywhere. And the only time we left that internment camp was to go to a funeral at Bad Ragaz. An American bomber had crashed in the mountains, and there were about now 50 or 60 American internees. We were taken en masse to Bad Ragaz for their funeral. I remember carrying the coffins of these poor guys. The bodies were decomposing. You could smell the bodies through the wooden coffins. But we had this funeral for them and came back to Machelen. The hotel we were staying in which the Swiss had commandeered as the internment camp, was a very old hotel, and it had no heating, so it got very cold. And in November, they decided they had to move us, and we were moved to a place called Adelboden up in the Berner Oberland, up in the Alps. And I remember when we got there early in November, it snowed for 5 days, and it just turned the area into a winter wonderland, something like Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. It was really beautiful with the snow. But I've always, since the mountains, as beautiful as they were, I've always been of two minds about mountains. I think they are impressive and beautiful, but to me they were like walls. I couldn't get out, and they still feel a little oppressive in that sense. I've often put it this way. When I first came to New York City after the war, I lived in Manhattan Island, and for 8 months, for the first 8 months, I had no reason to leave Manhattan, and it didn't bother me at all. But if someone would have said, "You cannot leave Manhattan Island," I would have been standing on the shore of the Hudson River with my tongue hanging out and looking at New Jersey. But at any rate, we were in Adelboden, and I established a educational program for the internment camp. People were getting a little stir-crazy there, so I had this crude program of educating everybody. I sort of had compulsory classes to keep them active. I taught classes in history and English and geometry. Other officers taught other subjects. I brought in a couple of Swiss to teach foreign languages. One of the radio operators taught people Morse code. At any rate, it helped to fill the time. But in February, just 6 months after I'd landed there, I got the summons to go to Bern. It came from Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles had arranged for 7 Americans to be exchanged for 7 Germans. There were in Switzerland at that time 4 German pilots and 3 student pilots. And Dulles wanted some information gotten out of the country. This was about 3 months before the invasion at Normandy. And so he asked the Swiss to sound out the Germans about an exchange. And the Germans agreed to this exchange. And so 6 pilots and a navigator were now going to go out in behalf of those 7 Germans. But Dulles had other reasons for doing this. He wanted information carried out, and so he called me in a week before the transfer was to take place, and I spent this time memorizing information that he wanted transmitted back to Washington. I didn't realize it at the time, but that navigator was also memorizing. Neither of us knew that both of us were doing this, and when we got back to Washington, I suppose the OSS could check our memorizations separately to see whether everything was right. My departure from Switzerland was, in a sense, almost as dramatic as my arrival, because we left from Basel, Switzerland. The railroad station there was half in Germany and half in Switzerland. And the German side of the station, the German side of this huge main chamber, was covered with huge Nazi banners. The station was totally deserted. There was no one else in it as we walked across. And it gave you a feeling of some concern to be suddenly facing the enemy going into Germany. We're at war with these people. And what added to my concern a little bit more was the fact that the German officer who was waiting to receive us wore the black uniform of Himmler's sinister SS. And these guys are kind of scary looking, I suppose. This man, who was a major, had a dagger at his side, and when we approached him, he clanged his heels and raised his arm with a loud cry of "Heil Hitler." Well, we were being accompanied by the Swiss diplomat, and incidentally, the Germans had insisted that we wear civilian clothing, so we didn't consider ourselves anything but civilians, and we simply nodded our heads as the Swiss diplomat did. We didn't return his salute. But the fact that this guy was SS also got me worried, because I thought the Germans must be watching Dulles. Dulles, I spent some time with him. He lived in a very nice mansion in Bern, which was approached only through a grove of trees, or like an ivy trellis or something. I just remember that approach. You didn't come in there directly. You came through it to these trees. And Dulles had told me more than once, they're always watching me. And I thought to myself at the time, well, of course they're watching you. You were the chief spy of the Americans here. But now, as I'm approaching this SS guy, I'm thinking, oh boy, they must have been watching. What if the SS people took out a photograph and said, by the way, Mr. Lieutenant Andrews, do you know Mr. Dulles? And here I've been memorizing all this information. I knew all kinds of stuff about their troop movements, about their fortifications along the French coast. I knew a lot about their people who were spies, although only by code. And so this gave me a little worry. But the SS officer and a couple of others took us down below to the train, and now we were taken over by a Wehrmacht guard, an German army guard of a captain, a sergeant, and a corporal. And these were less troublesome in a way, or less worrisome, because they didn't have that same ideology. The German army captain didn't speak any English, but he did speak a little French, so I was able to communicate a bit with him. And the sergeant spoke English. But at any rate, the 7 of us Americans with the 3 Germans were put into 2 small compartments, and this began one of the eeriest railroad journeys I've ever had in my life. We headed up the Rhine Valley, and the train seemed to stop at every station, and at every station more and more soldiers and officers got aboard. They were headed back to France through the West Wall, and the train had heavy anti-aircraft guns front and back. You could see it in the long curves, these guns, and we began sweating out our own people, because the American Air Force and the British too had begun a habit of shooting up German trains. But we moved up the Rhine Valley, and very quickly that train, which, as I say, was loaded with Germans, the word got around that there were these 7 Americans, and some of the German officers, particularly ones with some clout, arranged with the guard to come in and talk with us. And I remember there was one German lieutenant, an infantry lieutenant, who told me that he'd gone to Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and he gave me the address of his aunt in Cleveland. And when I got back, I sent her a postcard that I'd seen her nephew. Another officer, a major in the Luftwaffe, was not so pleasant. He was highly decorated. He had the Knight's Cross around his neck, which is the highest medal that the Germans have. He had ribbons indicating he'd been in the Afrika Korps and on the Russian front. And but he was not pleasant at all. He said, "You Americans, bomber pilots are terrorists and barbarians." And he also added that the Germans didn't like President Roosevelt at all. So I told him, well, that's nothing compared to how much the Americans hate Adolf Hitler. So with that, he turned around and left. The 3rd German officer, whom I remember best of all, was an infantry colonel who apparently, although he didn't say so, was attached to some group along the French coast. And he said, you know, we Germans cannot defeat you Americans, but neither can you Americans defeat us. Our defenses are too strong. You cannot defeat us. Why don't we get together and fight the Russians? I say that because that seemed to be the sentiment of a lot of German officers. They were suggesting that, you know, they weren't bad guys. Why don't we join the Germans and fight the Russians? The main reason, I think, though, a lot of Germans came by to see us on the train was to bum cigarettes. We didn't have any American cigarettes, but we did bring with us, each of us, 2 cartons of Swiss cigarettes, and these were a lot better than the ones that the Germans had. And I remember saying to Albert, the sergeant, the Wehrmacht sergeant who was guarding us, he chain smoked all the while he was with us. And I said, Albert, you're going to have a very sore throat when this is over. He said, oh, yes, but it'll be the first sore throat I've had from smoking cigarettes in 7 years. Well, we came into Paris, the Gare de l'Est, and had to go to another railroad station. And there we were met by 2 German army majors. They had 2 Dodge station wagons with swastikas painted on the sides. And they gave us a quick tour of Paris, not showing any anti-aircraft guns at all, but some of the main sites. And one of these German officers spoke English with a Scottish brogue, and he told me that he'd been a peacetime attorney, a lawyer in Berlin, and had a number of clients in Edinburgh. But again, the Germans were trying to impress us or ingratiate themselves. They were the good guys. And at the next railroad station where we took a train going south, they served us a 6-course meal and gave us each a bottle of champagne. But now we headed south to Spain, and we passed through Bordeaux, where the Germans made no attempt to stop us. We were looking out the window. You could see naval as well as commercial activity along the docks. And I understood later that one of the reasons they never sent air crews back to the same combat area once they'd escaped or gotten out was that if I'd been caught by the Germans a second time, they could have legally executed me as a spy. I'm reporting on stuff I've seen in Bordeaux, as well as other things, of course. But our journey with the Germans ended at Hendaye in southern France, the very same place where Hitler had come in 1940 to meet General Franco, a little railroad stop there. And from there we were told to walk across the little Bidasoa River to Irun, Spain. And now another thing happened. There were about 40 to 50 Spanish members of the Blue Division. They'd been fighting with the Germans in Russia. They were very, very anti-American. And they began yelling and screaming at us, but the Swiss diplomat soon came up, and we went away with him to San Sebastian. And from San Sebastian, we took a train south to Madrid. And the Swiss diplomat pointed out to us on the train there were 2 Gestapo agents also watching us in civilian clothing. In Madrid, we stayed for a couple of days. I was put up at the home of the U.S. Naval Attaché. And then we motored south to Seville and on to Gibraltar. And from Gibraltar, we flew to Casablanca. And then from Casablanca, we flew home. I always remember that flight from Casablanca because there were us 7 Americans, and there were 3 generals and an admiral on the plane. It was a C-54, which is a big cargo plane. And there were 2 or 3 bunks on that plane, but the generals and the admiral drew for those. We Americans, the rest of us, the lieutenants, lay on the deck there or in the jump seats. But that was neither here nor there. It wasn't a bad trip. We got to New York, and then we went to Washington. And a funny thing happened on the trip to Washington. We took the train from New York to Washington. And this was wartime, of course, and we were wearing civilian clothing. And there were a couple middle-aged ladies who began making noises about us draft dodgers. We looked far too healthy not to be in the service. But we found this amusing. We didn't say anything about who we were. We thought it was funny. But in Washington, we were briefed at the Pentagon. And after the Pentagon, Titus, this navigator, and I were taken to the OSS had a little farm in Virginia where we were interrogated by the OSS. And once I regurgitated all I'd memorized, I was thanked by this admiral. I remember that admiral especially because one of the things Dulles had brought to my attention and wanted transmitted back to the United States was a little idea of his. He had some object that he wanted moved out of Switzerland. I think it may have been a history of Germany or something by one of the friendly German spies or one of the Germans who was working with the Americans. And he asked me if it was possible to fly a seaplane from an aircraft carrier in the Adriatic Sea across to Lago Maggiore, which was the place where I had landed. And I told him, well, it's possible, Mr. Dulles, but seaplanes are slow, and I'm afraid that it would get shot down by German fighters. I think Dulles was disappointed at this, but he wanted me to tell me, be sure to tell this to that admiral, which I did, of course. But the admiral took me out, and Titus, out to lunch at the Army-Navy Club in Washington, which was rather nice since we were just lieutenants and he's a flag officer. And I remember the last thing he said to me, well, he said, Lieutenant Andrews, thank you very much. You've done a good service to us and to your country. But now, I want you to forget all that you've memorized. Believe me, Lieutenant, it's as easy to forget as it is to remember. And so I followed his advice, and it's very hard to remember all of the things that I memorized. From Washington, after the OSS, I was given a 30-day home leave, and then I was assigned to the Air Transport Command, which was very fortunate because I became a ferry pilot, and I ended up as one of the elite pilots who was checked out on every multi-engine airplane that the Army Air Forces had. I flew everything, P-38 to the B-29, and of course I got to see a bit of the world in doing that. I was assigned to Gore Field in Great Falls, Montana, and we handled chiefly B-17s, B-29s coming out of Seattle, but I got to fly all the other aircraft too. And so the war ended as my being just a ferry pilot. But looking back, I'm very grateful to Switzerland because if that little country hadn't been there, my crew members and I would have spent nearly 2 years in German prison camps, if indeed we've gotten down to the ground alive. And so every September 6th, I take a few minutes to give thanks and to remember that fortuitous landing at Magadino.